Good to see everyone here this morning. We know that as we begin, that we have Tuesday nights, ladies' night at Hope. Julie's going to be the speaker there. You're all invited to attend, and we're going to take the van. The van's going to leave here at 5 o'clock. If you can be here by then and go, and for the ladies' night there this Tuesday night, beginning at 5 o'clock, leave here at the building. We know we have several visitors here, and we just want to make mention of family who came back to visit us. So we have over here, we have the Lewansons with us and the Hendricks with us. And so that we're so glad to have you here. So tickled about that. Oh, we'll get to visit with you a little bit later, but it's so good to see you. You're in our prayers. You certainly are. And we sure appreciate that and look forward to good things. We're in the book of Matthew. Open the Bibles up to Matthew chapter 1 as we begin. There's Betty right there. It's so good to see you. Matthew chapter 1. The whole purpose of Matthew is pointing to Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. That he was the perfect sacrifice for us. In fact, he was the only sacrifice for us, which could be. And so we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as we talk about the plan of God and Jesus coming. And so we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Very similar. If you go through reading through the New Testament and begin at the beginning at Matthew, and you read the book of Matthew, and then you read the book of Luke, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll say, well, they're all pretty similar toward each other. And in fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more similar than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John does talk about the life of Jesus, but we went through the book of John, and we showed us that John is a little bit different. And so we have, there we go. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar in their reading and their all what they talk about Jesus. Very similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, I ran across this little cartoon. It said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, I want to see you about your book report. You know, they're all surprisingly alike. And so it is. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more similar than John, even though John does cover the life of Christ also. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover that. And so when we pick up in the New Testament and the reading of the book of Matthew, and there's a separation you have the Old Testament and you have the New Testament. You have the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And there's about 400 years, we call it 400 years of silence during that time of the ending of the Old Testament, beginning of the New Testament. And so we don't have anything recorded of what God interacted with his people during this 400 years from Malachi to Matthew. And so during this 400 years of silence, whenever we end the last book of the Old Testament and begin the Matthew, the New Testament, that we left off with the Old Testament with the Persians ruling. And now in the book of Matthew we have the Romans ruling. In the Old Testament we don't have mention of the synagogues. We have the Jews meeting in the temple, but we don't have record of synagogues in the Old Testament. And 400 years later, we go to the New Testament, and we have synagogues. And synagogues are where the Jews met who were outlying, they were scattered abroad, and so they would come to Jerusalem and worship in the temple during the feast days, but they would have we would say, regular worship, their Saturday worship, there in the synagogues in their city. We don't have mention of that in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we have many synagogues scattered around throughout the region of the land. In fact, our New Testament worship, what we do this morning, is very similar to synagogue worship. In synagogue worship, they came together and they sang, much as we would sing. In synagogue worship, they would open the Scriptures and expound the Scriptures. And so what we do during preaching. In synagogue worship, they would have the prayer. Now, they didn't have the Lord's Supper in synagogue worship. We have that since Christ had died. But very similar, they would sit in seats. Now, these were concrete seats. They would sit U-shaped. So instead of like this, they would be more along the side and toward the back. They'd be U-shaped, and the preacher would be up at the front, and they would all be pointed toward him as someone would read the Scriptures and then expound on the Scriptures. But our New Testament worship is very much similar to synagogue worship. And then we have Greek is a common language spoken throughout all of the region land. And so things have changed since Old Testament to New Testament. It's been a period of time. But it was also prophesied. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 44 in particular, when it says that Daniel, who was taken away into captivity, and we're going to talk about captivity in just a little bit, but when he was taken away into captivity, that during the 70 years of captivity, now captivity is a big thing with the Jewish people, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But in these days of these kings, now Nebuchadnezzar saw a dream. If you can remember the book of Daniel, he had this vision, this image that he had a head of gold, silver, bronze, and then iron. And then he said this stone came down the mountain and rolled down and destroyed this image. So what does that dream mean? And Daniel explained the dream to him. And he said, you, King Nebuchadnezzar, you were the head of gold. The Babylonian Empire is the world reigning empire during this time. And you, Nebuchadnezzar, are that king and that head of gold. But yet you will not last. And there will be another kingdom which shall come, and that was the Persian kingdom. They conquered the Babylonians, and then the Persians became the world empire. And it's during the time of the Persians that those who were captured by the Babylonians went down and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. They took away captives up into Babylon. And when the Persians became the world ruling empire, they said to the people, you can go back to your land. And the people did, or many of them did. Most of them stayed. Not just a remnant left and went back to Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple and rebuilt the walls, and made Jerusalem the holy city that it was during the time of Jesus. But that's 400 years later on during the time of Jesus. But the Persians wouldn't be the ruling empire forever. Then came the Greeks. Alexander the Great, you remember that story with him, and he conquered the world. And it said that after he conquered the world at age 33, he sat down and cried because there's nothing else to do in this land. But he's king over the world. What else is there? And so we had the Greeks being the reigning empire. And then you had the Romans. The Romans came and conquered the Greeks. And during the time of Jesus, the Romans were the ruling empire. But during this time of the Roman rule, there's going to be a stone come, and there's going to be a King of kings and Lord of lords, which shall be set up, and God shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the Jews were looking for that king, and they were looking for that time for a kingdom to be established, never to be destroyed. Boy, that would be wonderful. That would be great. We're going to rise to promise again. We're not only going to have this land that God promised us, which was about 60 miles north and south, about 30 miles wide. We're not only going to have that, we're going to be the reigning world empire. Boy, they were looking forward to that. Whenever God would set up Messiah, the anointed one, and that's what the word Christ means, Messiah or anointed one, the pouring over. And so we have the book of Matthew, and Matthew begins with authority that Jesus of Bethlehem, born in Bethlehem, Jesus of Nazareth, raised in Nazareth, that Jesus whom you crucified is the anointed one. that was prophesied in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament. And so he begins with a lot of names there in the book of Matthew. Just names after names after name. And whenever we read these names and look at these names, we say, well, what do these names mean? Why would you begin with name after name after name? Well, remember from last time that we met that he's writing to the Jews. And to the Jews, heritage and name is everything. And he's writing to these, and they are 14 generations. 14 generations and 14 generations. Can you read that? And so they are, let me say first of all, there's no coincidence in the providence of God. Whenever we read 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations, there's no coincidence in the providence of God. Everything happened at just the right time that God determined for it to happen. Every woman was born at just the right time that God determined that they would be born. Every generation from the time of Abraham to the time of David to the time of captivity. And let me mention now why the time of captivity was so important. Because God promised them. Remember, God promised Abraham 3 promises. We went through this in the book of Romans. God promised Abraham 3 promises. That he promised the stars. He said, your descendants shall be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sands in the sea. God made a promise to Abraham. And his descendants are as numerous as the stars in the sky. They're uncountable. And then he said, I'll make you a promise of land. And during the time in Genesis 15, when Abraham was in the land of Canaan, God said, look around all this land. Now, Genesis 12, God made a promise, but in Genesis 15, Abraham was in the land of Canaan, and he looked around. All this land that you see will be yours and your descendants. I'll give you this land. The land of Canaan. The land flowing with milk and honey. The promised land, as we are told here. Your descendants shall be numerous. I will give you this land. And then the third blessing is, through you and your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. 3 promises of Abraham fulfilled today. We are children of Abraham, descendants of Abraham. Now I said, remember when I said I'm not a Jew. This Matthew was written to the Jews. I'm a Gentile. But I am a descendant of Abraham, Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and 27. Flip over there real quick and look at that. You're all children of God by faith. By faith we're children of God. We're all descendants of Abraham, as it is that as we have been baptized into Christ, we put on Christ. We are heirs of that promise. The promise is, through you and your seed shall all the nation of the earth be blessed. And we are those who are receiving that blessing, the spiritual blessing. We don't have the land promise. We're not dwelling over in Canaan. But we have the heaven promise. The promised land, eternity. And so through you and your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Genealogy is so important with the Jews. And when it was that they were taken away into captivity, they were taken out of that land. Oh, God said you will dwell in this land forever. But whenever King Nebuchadnezzar and all the Babylons, whenever they came down and conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the city, destroyed the wall, took them off into captivity for 70 years. For 70 years, they did not dwell in the promised land. They were so concerned they had lost that promise. They prayed to God, turned back to God, and God delivered them 70 years later. And then they dwelt in the land again. But the land promise is so important from the time to captivity, from the time of Abraham to the time of David. David, King David, when Jerusalem was in its highlight of glory. And then 14 generations to the captivity, whenever they lost their land. And then 14 generations to Jesus being born. Let me tell you, if you go to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 7, verse 64, we know we went through the book of Nehemiah, and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. The Babylonians had taken the Jews captive. They've been held in captivity 70 years. The Persians come and set the captives free. The captives go back to Jerusalem, build the temple, and build the wall. When they built the wall, Nehemiah 7, verse 64, they sought the registry of those who were reckoned by genealogy. And so they were saying, who is a Jew? Who can trace your lineage back to Abraham? And some of them had lost their heritage. Whenever they were taken away into captivity for 70 years, they didn't write it down. They didn't write down Mama and Daddy and Grandma and Grandpa. In 70 years, they didn't keep up with it. And when they found the record, some of those were not in the record. It said they were not found. They were as polluted and put from the priesthood. They said, well, I'm of the tribe of Levi. I'm a priest. My great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy was of the tribe of Levi. And they said, well, he might have been, and his son would, and his son would, and his son would, but your father's not there, and you're not there. You cannot serve as priests. That's how important genealogy is. And so Matthew is setting the genealogy of Jesus to show that he is a child of Abraham. He's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He listed every family from Abraham all the way to Jesus. And that's what Matthew chapter 1 is. You're reading name after name after name. He's showing the authority of Jesus. He is the fulfillment of the promise of Abraham. And so we reread these. Think of that heritage. Heritage is so important. And so when you read through these, Jesus is going to be the one that sets up the kingdom from Daniel chapter 2. In the days of these kings, God shall establish a kingdom. He will have a king, and that king is going to be Jesus. And so when you read through these, now Jesus did set up a kingdom in Matthew chapter 16, but he called it the church. He said, I will build my church. Well, what does church have to do with the kingdom? Well, the kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. It's not a physical kingdom. Jesus did not set up a kingdom. He's not sitting on the throne in Jerusalem to reign upon that throne like the throne of David. He set up a spiritual kingdom. He called it the church. The church is a God-ordained institution, set up and prophesied thousands of years before the church ever came into existence. But the anointed one, the Messiah, the one chosen by God, is going to set up the church. And we're a part of that church. And the church shall continue, and the church shall continue for all eternity as we go on up into heaven. But his kingdom is still here, and we're part of that kingdom. The church. We're part of that kingdom that Jesus set up, the kingdom of heaven. He said, I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That death shall not prevail against it. His death shall not prevail against it because of his resurrection. Now, if you go back through and reading here, I want to just point out there are 4 women mentioned here. They're highlighted, different color. It says Perez by Tamar. Who's Tamar? Tamar was a daughter-in-law of Judah. And Judah had done her wrong because whenever Tamar's husband died, she was supposed to be married to the next oldest brother. The older brother was to take her for wife. Well, he didn't want her. So the next brother, Judah said, listen, hang around here, Tamar, and whenever my son becomes of age, then he will marry you. that was the way it was with the Jews. For the lineage, the heritage, you kept it in the family. That's old covenant law. That you married your brother-in-law if your husband died. That's what God said. And so it was, whenever it came to pass that youngest son came of age, Judah did not give him for a husband to Tamar. If you read about the story, Tamar, I just dressed as a harlot, had sexual relations with Judah, and bore a son. Boy, what a lineage in the line of Christ, isn't it? And then we go down to Rahab. Who's Rahab? Rahab hid the spies whenever the spies came to Jericho. And it doesn't say Rahab the harlot, but every time she's mentioned in the Old Testament, it's mentioned Rahab the harlot, the prostitute. We have one who dressed as a prostitute, and one who lived the life of a prostitute in the lineage of Jesus. And then we have Ruth. Now, Ruth was not a Jew. Ruth was a Moabite. And so it was Ruth. We know the great story in the book of Ruth as her husband passed away, and she went with her mother-in-law who was a Jew. And these great words that as Ruth's mother-in-law told her to leave and go back to your land, she said, I will not leave you or forsake you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And Ruth, who was a Moabite instead of a Jew, is in the lineage of Jesus. And then we have, not even mentioned by name, the wife of Uriah. That's Bathsheba. We know as David, who was king, looked over and saw Bathsheba bathing, took her, had a child with her. The first child passed away, but the next one was Solomon, king. And so what a lineage, isn't it, that we have with these. And so we have Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba. More like instead of a hall of fame, it's a hall of shame, isn't it? And let me tell you, God uses everyone in his kingdom. Doesn't matter your background. God can use you to fulfill his plan. And that would be what I would say, that as we look through three things about all the names. I'm not going to read the names. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can read them yourself. What about names? Let me tell you, first of all, Jesus Christ. Christ is not his middle name. My name is Jerry David. My cousins call me Jerry David. Julie said, how come all your cousins call you Jerry David? I said, well, when I got in trouble, Mama would say, Jerry David, and I knew I was in trouble. And I was in trouble a lot when I hung around my cousins. And so that's what they heard all the time, Jerry David. And so they called me Jerry David. But it's Jesus Christ, as we mentioned that, Christ is not his middle name. Now, Jesus is his name. Christ is his title. Christ means the anointed one, the Messiah, the one chosen of God to fulfill his plan, his plan for saving man. And Jesus, the Christ, the anointed one, the chosen one, would be more proper to say on this. And so there are three lessons from reading through a bunch of names. Number one, there are no coincidences in the providence of God. At just the right time, it is. Jesus was born. There are no coincidences. Whenever we read through the Old Testament, especially with the Old Testament, We can see that it was that Nebuchadnezzar was set up at just the right time. And he came down and he conquered Jerusalem and took the Jews away into captivity. And then the Persians came at just the right time, and they conquered the Babylonians, and they set the captives free. And they went down and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem, so that 400 years later, whenever Jesus was born, the Jewish nation would be in prominence as it is, and the Jewish temple would be in use as it is, and the walls around Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be a great and holy city, because hundreds of years before, God's timing is just right. There are no coincidences in the timing of God and in your life. Well, what a coincidence. No, God's timing, number two. God's timing is always right. And in King James it says, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly." You may have a different version that says, "At just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." And it is at just the right time. Christ died for the ungodly. There are no coincidences in the providence of God. And God's timing is always right. That's what I see with a lot of names. Every name there has purpose. Every name is not perfect. Right. Boy, we can see a lot of people who sinned against God in the lineage of Jesus. But God used imperfect people. He used common people to accomplish an uncommon plan. You would think, well, even with Abraham, I was going to say, you would think everyone would be like Abraham, the father of the faithful. But if you go through the life of Abraham, Abraham was not perfect. There are times in Abraham's life that he lied, right? There are times in David. David, a man after God's own heart, committed adultery, committed murder. Judah, from the tribe of Judah. Judah. Oh, we can just go through name after name. There are no perfect people in the lineage of the perfect person, Jesus Christ. But God uses common people to accomplish an uncommon task. And He uses us today. We're not perfect. I don't think anyone here would say, oh, I'm perfect. No, we're not. We have our imperfections. We have our sins. We have our flaws. We have our shortcomings. But still, God can use us and does use us in fulfilling His plan for saving man. In fact, we are the only plan that He has. He doesn't have any other plan for salvation except through us. For us to go and to tell someone, as it says here, you go into all the world and you teach the gospel. That's on our shoulders. If we don't go and teach, they don't hear it. It's not told. It's not passed on from generation to generation if we don't go tell people. God's put it in our hands. Our hands? Oh, I'm not worthy to talk about it. I'm not worthy to save someone. No, you're not. God didn't call you just because you were so good or so holy or so set apart. He called you because you're so faithful. Your faith. Do you really believe? Do you really believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? As we go through the book of Matthew, I want you to know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That whenever we finish the book of Matthew and we see Jesus on the cross and we see His resurrection, to know for certain, that's my Savior, that's my Lord. And Matthew begins setting the authority, and authority has to be set up that He is a child of Abraham. He is the one prophesied throughout the Old Testament. You know, there are over 300 prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament fulfilled in the New Testament. Look it up. Google it, and I'm not going to read them all right now. But you can do that when you go home. The prophecies, just to type in prophecies of Jesus fulfilled in New Testament. And you can just list those one after another after another. And to show that Jesus is the one fulfilling these prophecies, in fact, there are times in the book of Matthew that we will read these words that it might be fulfilled. You see, he's writing to Jews about God fulfilling the old covenant, and they were very familiar with the old covenant. The Gentiles weren't, but the Jews were. And so when we read that it might be fulfilled, we're going to pause a little bit at that time and talk a little bit about that fulfillment. The three lessons. There are no coincidences in the providence of God. God is doing just exactly as he planned to do. God's timing is always right. You see, at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Well, why didn't he wait till now? And we could put it on the internet and everyone could see it. Oh, maybe God didn't know the internet was coming. Oh. No, he chose just the right time. And it was the right time. And don't doubt that. At just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. And then God uses common people to accomplish an uncommon plan. That's you and me. We have it in our hands. And God has no other plan than using us to save the world. Helping the world. One person at a time. We're going to leave off at verse 17. Julie and I are going to go see our daughter in Springfield next week, and we'll be back the following week, and we'll talk about the birth of Jesus. That was very uncommon as you read through that also. 3 lessons from Matthew. I hope that as we go through the book of Matthew, it just deepens your faith in knowing and setting forth principle after principle or prophecy and fulfillment after prophecy and fulfillment to show that Jesus is the Son of God, the sacrifice for our sins, that God provided a way that we can go to heaven through the sacrifice of his Son, through the anointed one, through the kingdom set up, through his church. The church is so important. If we can help you and encourage you and strengthen your faith, doing whatever we can, praying for you, we offer the invitation that if we can, whatever we can do, we're here together to go to heaven. If you need prayers for strength, encouragement, forgiveness, if you want to become a Christian and say, I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, I'm willing to walk down these aisles and make that confession before everyone here. I want to be baptized so that my sins would be washed away. I want to go to heaven. I want to live faithful all the days of my life. Why not now? Why not respond to the gospel invitation right now while we stand and while we sing?